I wonder, like, what will you go to from here? Just anecdotal evidence all the time? That doesn't seem like a much better approach, right?
It's not. I mean, we have to survey, we have to poll, but we also have to be aware of our limitations. So put the numbers out there, make the phone calls, but also be aware that you're going to have people lying to you, that you're going to have people hanging up on you, and that the results you get in the end, despite the decimal points after the number, don't represent reality as closely or as reliably as we'd like it to be. If it's on the nose, it's an accident. And these could help us to guide us. They can give us an idea of what's going on, but they're not precise. And the world that exists around us is going to continue to be resistant to analysis. Doesn't mean it can't be analyzed, but it can't be quantified quite so precisely as we'd like it to be. And in this case, the percentage of gun owners in the United States is probably a lot higher than 30%. It's going to be lower than 100%, certainly. But that gives us a much wider range with which to work than we thought we had before. We just know that a lot of Americans are gun owners and they own a lot of guns. And getting a better handle on that is going to be a challenge going forward.
Yeah, certainly. That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of, polling is useful. Studies are useful. Scrutiny of them is also important, though, for the reasons you laid out there, and for the reasons that this study makes clear. There is a tendency, I think, to either, people like to go to the extremes on things oftentimes, where it's either, scientific study of this is totally perfect and without question, or it's completely useless and shouldn't be looked at all. And I think there's obviously a middle ground in there that makes a lot more sense. And as I'm sure you agree, because there's the more what's the right way to say this? There's the more sensational aspect to this study, where they found that the numbers, maybe half the people who said they didn't own guns really did. And then there's the more modest outcome where they raised the bar for what they considered, somebody who was likely a gun owner from, having 50% probability to 75% probability. And there it was still significant miss, right? It was still like 10% of people saying they didn't own guns when they really did. But the only thing that, I would take away from that is, there is a way to look at this study and find it somewhere within what polling has shown us, right? Because they started from 33% of people openly admitting they own guns to the pollsters, which is pretty in line with what you see from Gallup and Pew and the Associated Press and some of the other major pollsters that ask this question on a regular basis. And then if you add that 10% or so, I think it was a little more than 10%, for the more conservative estimation of how many people are not necessarily openly admitting they're going to be gun owners, but probably do own a gun. You get somewhere in the 40% range, somewhere in the mid 40%. And that's what you'll find with pollsters who ask the question, does somebody in your home own a gun? Do you have a gun in your home? And so the other more modest explanation, I guess, would be that perhaps the people are saying no when they're asked if they own a gun don't consider themselves to be gun owners, but are people who live with gun owners, right? A wife whose husband owns a gun might not consider herself a gun owner, but there's a gun in her home, right? And so that's the other explanation that you could go. There's the explanation that we're wildly off with how many people really own a gun, and then there's the explanation that what this is really showing us is just that difference between people who consider themselves gun owners and people who have a gun in their home, because they're going to be demographically similar to their, a wife is going to be demographically similar to her husband in a lot of ways, most likely. What do you think of that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, that range of possibility is certainly going to be helpful. And yes, a spouse of a gun owner is probably going to have similar attitudes and responses to a survey as an actual gun owner. In this case, though, remember that almost half of those, they identified as probable gun owners, falsely saying they are not gun owners. are unmarried urban women of color. So
That's true.
they're not going to have, they may have a partner, but they're going to have a lower likelihood of having a household where somebody else is the gun owner and they simply share the attitudes. So you probably have a fairly high percentage of those that actually are gun owners falsely answering the survey. But your larger point is, I think I agree with entirely, which is that this at least points us in a direction. It gives us ranges to work with. And if we don't demand precision, if we want to know, okay, what's the general thrust? I think this tells us, okay, gun ownership is not shrinking. It's probably expanding, and it's expanding into areas of the population that were previously not considered to have a high likelihood of engaging in gun ownership. So that points to other research areas, which is why. And also, why are they resistant to being surveyed? There's some speculation as to that in the research, but that's speculation. And I think that we'll probably see them following that up in the future to find out why are they so privacy oriented. Let's kind of narrow that down and see if there's a way to get a better handle on that. And if there are implications from that for policy making, for politics, and also, of course, for research methods.
Yeah. And what do you make of the fact that it seems as though the majority of people they identified as reluctant to, disclose their gun ownership are these sort of gun culture 2.0 type owners? The minorities, they're women, they're more urban, they live in more urban areas. That's your more modern gun owner, the less stereotypical gun owner that, perhaps a lot of people picture when they think of a gun owner. The stereotype is, an old white guy who lives out in the country and likes to hunt. It's Elmer Fudd, basically,
yeah.
Right? And we've known for a while now that that's not representative of your average gun owner anymore, especially people who are becoming gun owners for the first time, especially during the pandemic, since the pandemic. And so, what do you make of the fact that group appears to be even more resistant, perhaps, to sharing with researchers that they own guns than your uncle who has an NRA hat or something?
Well, it has interesting implications for policy and for law. I mean, it tells us that I'm not surprised that, for instance, that urban areas might be culturally and politically unfriendly to gun ownership. I'm a former New Yorker myself. I owned a gun in New York. I was able to get a pistol permit, which took some jumping through hoops. But I also knew that owning a gun in New York was frowned upon by a lot of people. So I didn't talk about it a lot. So I'm not at all surprised that someone living in an urban environment surrounded by people who are culturally resistant to firearms ownership, where the law is restrictive, and we're running afoul of the law, might be a matter of interpretation, would not want to advertise the fact that they have now joined the ranks of gun owners. It might cause problems with the neighbors, might cause problems with the police. Even if you're not breaking the law, maybe they knock on the door. Who wants that? So it points to an expanding population of gun owners. We already know that about 2.9% of Americans became new gun owners during the pandemic and since. That adds up to, I think, 7 million households, 5 million new individual gun owners, something like that. It's actually more than that. So it's expanding population. And we know that a lot of them are women and minorities. So that means it's expanding into new directions, and that includes cities. That has big implications now for policy, politics, research. I mentioned earlier that it means you cannot safely target an ideological or partisan community now by legislating on guns, because you may end up hurting your own constituency if they've become quiet gun owners. So we have to be more careful of that. That's, I think, a good thing. I don't think that laws ought to be used as political weapons. I think that if you want to pass laws, whether or not I approve of those laws, they should be passed on their own merits and not as a means of tormenting your enemies. So that is probably a good outcome. It also means that urbanites are probably better armed than we've assumed in the past. New York has long admitted that they have no idea how many New Yorkers own guns. Well, a lot more than they thought. And that's going to be true of Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, cities across the country. So it has big implications for politics, for law, and it may well change the culture in the cities. If all of a sudden you accidentally find out that your neighbor also is a quiet gun owner, and you start talking about it, and more people talk about it, that's going to shift the culture. So that's going to have implications in the future as to maybe narrowing that divide between rural and urban culture, at least on this issue, maybe not in other issues. So there's a lot that could come out of this. It really points to some interesting research directions, both for now and also for the future.